and welcome. My name is Matt Travers. I'm the director of the Morrell Center for Legal and Political Philosophy, and through the kind generosity of the C&JB Morrell Trust, we sponsor today's Focus Day on criminal justice. So today's day, just to say a brief word about the day, is that I think everybody knows that the criminal justice system in many ways, in lots of parts of it anyway, are in crisis. Perhaps that crisis is interesting because aspects of it are perhaps temporary or perhaps easy to put down to funding or to austerity. But there's also, I think, a general sense of an almost existential worry that the kinds of things we do in criminal justice are the kinds of things we've been doing for a very long time, and they don't work, and we're not sure, we sort of lack the imagination to do things differently. And that applies right across the spectrum, from the very beginning of what one might think of as the criminal justice process and questions of criminalization, what do we criminalize, what don't we criminalize, through to how we police, through to how we prosecute and try, through to how we punish, and through to the sort of opposite end of the criminalization spectrum, how we try to rehabilitate people and help them to live non-criminal lives. And so our day today is going to, in lots of ways, sort of track all of those dimensions. In this first session, we're going to be thinking about the criminal justice system generally, and then in terms of specific aspects of it. And then our second session this afternoon is on policing and the problems in policing and restoring trust in the police. And then our third session will be on forms of punishment, and in particular focusing on prisons and whether prisons work, and post-prison regimes for trying, as I said, to help people to live non-criminal lives. So that's the structure of the day, and I very much hope that you'll be able to join us for all three sessions. But time is short, and you didn't come here to listen to me. That's one thing I'm absolutely confident about. So let me introduce our four speakers in the order they're going to go in. I'm not going to give the lengthy introduction. If I went through all of their many achievements, I would actually be talking for an hour, and they wouldn't be talking at all. So I'm going to give very brief versions of their biographies. Please do have a look on the website where you'll find their full biographies and their achievements. We are incredibly lucky to have the four speakers we have. In the order that they're going to go, Lucia Zedner is a senior research fellow at All Souls College and a professor of law in the law faculty at the University of Oxford, and one of the most distinguished professors of law in the country. She's worked a lot on criminal law, on security, on immigration control, written many books, and is currently serving as a commissioner on an independent commission on counterterrorism, law and policy. Joanna Hardy-Suskind is a practicing barrister at Red Lion Chambers in London, and I think it's relatively easy to sum Joanna up. She must hate hearing this. She's listed in the Legal Skills Legal 500, where she's described as, quote, an absolute star. What more could one ask for? And I thought you might frown at that. She's an advocate for legal aid and the jury system, and has often commented on the general state of things at the moment. Dame Anne Owers was appointed the first national chair of the Independent Monitoring Boards in November. Prior to that, she was chair of the Independent Police Complaints Commission, now the Independent Office for Police Conduct. She was Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons in the early 2000s and chaired a review of prisons in Northern Ireland. Finally, John Podmore, at the end, is now a sort of international criminal justice consultant. In an extraordinary career, he spent 26 years in the English and Welsh Prison Service, was governor of Her Majesty's Prison, His Majesty's Prison now, Belmarsh, Swalesdale, and Brixton. So he has an enormous amount of experience at the chalk face, as it were, of prisons. He contributes widely in the media on prison matters, and his book, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Why Britain's Prisons Are Failing, was published in 2011. So the way that the session is going to work is I'm going to invite each of the speakers to speak for 7 minutes, and if you see me sort of waving my paper, that's because I've alerted them that that's the way I'm going to try to alert them to the fact that their 7 minutes is almost up. I will then sort of mediate a conversation for a little while, and then I will make sure that we've got plenty of time for audience questions so that we can get feedback from you, get questions from you, and take those on. So without further ado, let me hand over to Lucia.
Thank you, Matt. You missed out the most important thing about me, which is just over 40 years ago, I graduated from this university, and I'm very happy to be back. Thank you for inviting me. So in my 7 minutes, I'm going to speak really fast. I'm going to try and answer 3 questions. What is crime? What is criminal justice? And what happens in the criminal process? And I'm going to try and bust a few myths. And, right, okay. And for the first question, what is crime? If we think about crime at all, most of us probably think about serious crimes, serious violence, murder, burglary, sexual offences, and so on. But actually, in the majority of criminal offences on the books, that is, the crimes themselves, are not targeted at the most serious offences. Having said that, it's actually really difficult to say exactly what our criminal law even looks like because we criminalise at such a rate. It's quite impossible, and I and a colleague hired somebody to try and do this. It's almost impossible to have anything like a comprehensive picture. One leading newspaper reported that in the last 8 years, there were 3,000 new criminal offences, which sounds crazy until you understand that these aren't mostly serious offences that are being passed in Parliament, but regulatory offences being passed by food safety bodies, environmental agencies, financial authorities, and so on. So are we right to think about criminal law and criminal justice as actually defining really serious wrongdoing? Or is criminal law just one regulatory tool amongst many that we use to run society? And why does it even matter? Well, one obvious reason why it matters is that if we think of criminal justice as something that we go to as an automatic kind of knee-jerk response to every single social problem, economic problem, financial issue, or whatever, and lean to criminalisation as the go-to resolution, then that results in massive over-criminalisation of the sort that I've just talked about. And I'm not making a party political point here. Political parties, governments of every political stripe have regarded for many decades now criminalisation as an automatic, or at least first response, even for relatively minor wrongdoing. And one of the problems, as we'll hear, I'm sure, from the other speakers, is that results in an overburdening of the whole policing and criminal justice system. And over-criminalisation really matters, I think, also because not only are we pulling too many people into the criminal justice system, but in a way we're kind of devaluing the very label crime and the idea that being convicted of a crime is actually something that we might morally condemn. So, second question, what's criminal justice for? Well, I've already suggested that actually it's not for what we're using it for at the moment. That is, if we resort to criminalisation so readily, we tend to assume that where there's a social problem or a problem of public order or difficulties within a family, it's for the police and the criminal justice system to respond. And I think there's a lot of mileage in the idea that many of the problems with which they're being called upon to respond might better be dealt with in other areas of government. Much of what we criminalise could be better tackled perhaps up front by welfare responses, affordable housing, decent childcare and education, and so on. By which, if it were done right, we might hope to divert people from even coming into the criminal justice system in the first place. So then, third question, what actually happens in the criminal justice process? And again, I think we suffer from, all of us suffer from kind of many misconceptions, very often brought about by media representations, TV, film, and so on. We're liable to think about criminal justice all about being dramatic court trials with juries being called upon to find villains guilty, who are then sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. And of course that happens, and that's an important part of criminal justice. But as a picture of the criminal justice system as a whole, it's quite misleading. Most suspected offences end up being marked by the police NFA. NFA stands for no further action. There's simply no point in pursuing that through the process. Of all the offences that come to the attention of the police, only about, less than 20% actually result in court. But that might be for really good reasons. A lot of what the criminal justice system is doing is filtering out. It's working out whether there's sufficient evidence to proceed. It's working out whether it's even in the public interest to proceed. And those two tests, sufficiency of evidence and public interest, are tests that the Prosecution Service has to satisfy before it takes a case forward. We're also minded to think that court cases happen before judge and jury, but in practice, less than 6% actually do. The vast majority of cases are heard in magistrates' courts before lay magistrates, usually in 2s or 3s, or in front of a single district judge. And so we have a much more kind of low-level system of justice, which is trundling away behind our public image of it about being the community represented through the jury, calling an offender to account, making a judgment upon them. And even if one takes the figures about what happens by way of disposals, if you look at all those who are convicted in both magistrates and Crown courts, taken in combination, only just over 6% are actually sentenced to custody, to prison. Everybody else is getting non-custodial penalties or fines. The vast majority of people are simply getting fines. And again, one might say, is the vast cost of the criminal justice system merited in tackling those people who may end up with relatively low-level fines? I'm going to finish just with one last observation before passing on to Joanna, which is that the media representations might also lead us to think that crime is rising relentlessly. But actually, if you look at responses to the official crime survey, which is thought to be, by many people, to be a more accurate measure than police recorded crime, crimes have fallen dramatically over the last 20 years. If you go back 18 years to 1995, there were 20,000 crimes reported to that survey. Last year, it was just 4,500. Given this long and significant decline in crime rates, we probably need somebody, looking at my co-panelists, to explain just why our criminal justice system is in such crisis as it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joanna.
As a criminal defence barrister, I get asked one question a lot, mainly by taxi drivers, but sometimes at polite dinner parties. And that question is, how can you represent the bad guys? And you might think that the darkest days of my work defending people in the criminal courts is representing the bad guys. And I spend most of my working life with people accused of murder, manslaughter, being paedophiles, terrorism. But they're not my worst days. Some of them are pretty bad. But my worst days as a criminal defence barrister are not representing the bad guys, but representing the good people. My sleepless nights come from representing good people who made a mistake, good people who fell short, good people who will forever be defined by the worst thing that they did, and the most lethal category of all, good people who have been wrongly accused. Those are my sleepless nights. And those good people are probably not dissimilar from you. And you might think, well, hold on a minute. I don't even have so much as an overdue library book. I don't get parking tickets. I've never been invited, unlike Suella Braverman, to a speed awareness course. I could never end up in a criminal dock, in a criminal courtroom, needing a lawyer like you. And to that I would say, that's what they all say to me. And the truth is that if you leave your house at any time and you drive a car, or you go to work in an office, or you socialise at a party or in a bar, or you have children who go to nightclubs and drink alcohol, we are all one step away from being in the dock. And I recognise them now. I recognise the haunted look in their faces, and they do things that my mum would do. They print out some documents in a nice little plastic file, and they say that they hope they can sort it all out today. And I realise that they don't realise how long this will take and what it will cost them, ultimately. And so those are my bad days. Those are my sleepless nights. And what that means is this for the criminal justice system as a whole. There is a shame attached to being accused of a crime. And that shame means that people don't talk about it. And what that means is that the criminal justice system, or at least the court system, can fester with injustice, with delay, with things that are patently unfair, and with ideas from politicians that are wild, in a way that other public services cannot, because they don't have the spotlight of scrutiny. And that, I'd like to talk to you today just very briefly about two areas that are of a lot of importance. The first is delay. It has become a sort of national hobby to talk about how long we wait for things on the NHS. My parents love talking to their neighbours about how long they've waited for things on the NHS. They're in a sort of race for a knee replacement. It's a national sport. We love talking about it. There's no shame to it. We love it. Nobody talks at a neighbour's barbecue about how long Billy has waited for his rape trial. Nobody goes to school parents' evening and bumps into an old friend and says, well, you'll never guess what, Derek's been suspended from work. They've accused him of fraud and we've been waiting for 2 years. You don't mention it because there's a shame attached to it. And that means the system has been allowed, and it has been allowed deliberately, to form a queue for justice that is now so long as to be, frankly, a scandal. I represented a young man recently who was arrested for a very serious offence, and he pleaded not guilty, and he had a fair defence to it. And he waited a year on bail, and that year for him and his mum was particularly difficult. They couldn't sleep. She told me she could barely eat for a year, and they were terrified. And they got to day 364 of the 365 days they'd been asked to wait. And on day 364, the court said, we don't have a judge next week to try this case. You'll have to rejoin the back of the queue. That happens to me, in my cases, I'd say 2 or 3 times a quarter. So that's 2 or 3 families, just in my professional career, and there are thousands of barristers out there who have to rejoin the back of that queue and wait again. Delay is important to victims of crime, because I'm not so naive as to think that some of my clients aren't guilty, because some of them are. Victims of crime having to wait that long to be heard is a scandal. Memories fade. If a parade walked through here now and out of that door with elephants, a band, dancing girls and music, and we were all asked in 5 minutes to describe what happened, we'd all describe it differently. Some of us would get details wrong. You might think the dancing girls were wearing pink. I might be quite sure they were wearing blue. We might disagree about the trumpets and what song they were playing, and if there was 1 elephant or 2. If we were asked to remember it in a year from now, we'd all get things wrong. And yet that's what we do every day in criminal courts. We say to people, what happened on the 28th of May 2021? Do you have any idea what you were doing on the 28th of May 2021? Because I finished a trial last week where we spent 6 days talking about the 28th of May 2021, and we were asking children, 2 13-year-olds and a 17-year-old, to remember. The second topic I'd like to talk to you about is juries. Juries have come in for a bit of stick recently. You might remember the case in Bristol. A load of people pulled a statue down. People were not happy with the jury's verdict. In cases of rape, people seem to think that juries acquit everybody. Let me give you a fact about juries in rape trials that always surprises people. This is a statistical fact. If a rape charge is put before a jury, the jury more often than not convicts. People are surprised by that. They say, well, hold a minute, last week I'm sure I read that rape statistics were at 0.001%. That is because in the timeline of a crime, someone makes an allegation, there are then many hurdles before it reaches the jury. Those hurdles before the jury need work. That is where the percentages fall down. But for rape allegations that we put before juries, they seem to be being dealt with pretty fairly and pretty well. Tell that to Scotland, who have piloted juryless rape trials. The idea that one judge or a panel of judges are better at determining facts, not law, facts that happen between 2 people, should alarm us. 12 people, if I picked out 12 of you now at random, your life experiences, your background, where you're from, what you think and how you approach things would complement the other 11. And what people sometimes say to me when I champion juries is they say, well, you'll never guess what, I did jury service and there was this one guy on the jury and he was a racist, he was thick, he couldn't count, he couldn't read, and he wanted to find the guy guilty because he was wearing a bow tie. That's what I get. And that's said to be a flaw of the jury system. You might get idiots, you might get people who are not very fair. But I always say this to those people, but you were there. You were a modifying voice in that voice of 12. And I'd much rather have 12 people, whether I was a victim, a complainant, a witness, or a defendant, than one judge. Our judges are still, I'm afraid, vast majority of them are men. They're all quite posh, and they're all getting a bit old. Most of my rape cases involve young people who communicate on Snapchat. Sometimes they take drugs. Sometimes they drink too much. Occasionally they have mental health problems or difficult lives or complex romantic relationships that need unpicking. And there is nobody better than 12 citizens. And I have not always agreed with verdicts of juries, but I have always understood them. And so for me, in assessing today our global theme of thinking about the criminal justice system and what we can do to make it better, we also ought to guard against what makes it good. And for me, the juries are at the heart of that. And we ought to be very vigilant about any attempts to interfere and to remove our right to be tried by 12 of our peers. And with that, I think I'll hand over to Damon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to start off with some statistics. When I became Chief Inspector of Prisons in 2001, there were 66,300 people in prison. There are now 85,400 people in prison. And the projections are that by 2025, there will be 106,300 people in prison. So I think the first question is, are we 60% more criminal than we were in 2001? Or has something happened in the way that we look at sentences, as Lucia was saying, that has resulted in this? So what are the drivers for those large numbers in prison? There are two drivers. One is the revolving door, the short sentences. The people who are sentenced often because they have addiction problems, because they have mental health problems, because they have learning disabilities, because they've been excluded from school, that the pattern of life that has developed, a chaotic often pattern of life, which means that they're in and out of prison very rapidly. Looking at mental health, for example, we recently produced at the Independent Monitoring Boards a report on women sent to prison on mental health grounds, not because they had committed an imprisonable offence, but because they had committed a minor offence, a public order offence, trespass, or trespass on a railway line, being suicidal, which meant they were sent to prison for their own protection or as a place of safety. And an indication of how safe and protective that is the rates of self-harm of those women. One woman self-harming 20 times a day, another woman who'd self-harmed 96 times and had to be admitted to hospital 8 times. So protective and safe it ain't. That's one driver. The second driver is longer sentences. There has been a bidding war to increase sentences in this country. When the death penalty was abolished in the 1960s, the average time a murderer spent in prison was 9 years. By about 2002, the minimum time a murderer would spend in prison was 11 years. In 2021, it was 21 years. So are people more dead now than they were in the 1960s or at the turn of the century? Or has something happened in terms of that, what I was talking about, that bidding war, about let's have tougher and tougher and tougher sentences, which always equals prison. It never equals anything else. If you look at the indeterminate sentences for public protection that were passed in the 2000s, which actually sentenced people not for what they'd done, but for what they might do. And you may have read that the Justice Committee recently recommended that there should be resentencing of those people. There are still nearly 3,000 of them in prison. Some of them have been in prison all the time. Some of them have been recalled to prison. And again, we did a report on the hopelessness of people serving those sentences that can't get access to programs they need to get out, can't convince the parole board to let them out, and are stuck in this interminable cycle. Within 3 weeks of the government refusing to follow the Justice Committee recommendation for resentencing, 3 of them took their own lives. And minimum sentences generally have been going on, and the most recent Secretary of State took upon himself the power to decide whether people should be sent to open prisons prior to release, whether they should be released at all. Recently, I've been in meetings with Lord Blunkett, who invented the IPP sentence, who is now in mea culpa mood, saying it was a dreadful mistake, and also with John Major, whose Justice Secretary was a guy called Michael Howard, who some of you may remember, who said that prison works, and John Major was at an audience telling people that prison absolutely doesn't work and we shouldn't do it. I think one of the ideas you might consider at this festival is that people shouldn't be able to pass laws in criminal justice until they've left office. So what are the implications of all of that? First of all, we've got prisons that are overcrowded, increasingly overcrowded, with people being doubled up in cells. Prisons that are less able to do the positive rehabilitative work, to get prisoners to the place they need to be, to get the programs that they need in order to get released, in order to change their lives around. We've got people now being sent to our open prisons, which are meant as a halfway house for people serving long sentences. They're being sent there just to relieve pressure, halfway up the country for 12 weeks at a time. So our prison system is hugely under pressure. And you've got to ally this to the other thing, which is that it's also understaffed. The prison system is having huge difficulties in recruiting staff and in retaining staff. Major loss of experienced staff in the age of austerity after 2012, 31% of experienced staff leaving. And since then, that has continued with retention problems. And you've got inexperienced staff with relatively inexperienced managers having to manage some very complex, vulnerable, challenging people. And there just aren't enough of them to do all the positive rehabilitative things that they're supposed to do. That thing called key work, which is individual staff knowing about an individual prisoner, being able to support them through the journey. Those positive things are much less likely to be able to happen in our overcrowded prison system. So we have to ask the question, what's prison for? And it surely isn't just about containment. It surely isn't just about plate spinning to see how on earth you can take in the people that the courts have just sentenced that you haven't got any space for. And surely also it's also not just about restructuring, going over and over again, restructuring and trying to develop a different system. It must be about trying to work out what's gone wrong and what we can do about it. There was recently a prison's white paper produced towards the end of 2021. What that did, it set out an ambitious strategy for rehabilitation, but it also said that they were going to create 20,000 more prison places. And I just quote from our response to that white paper, which said, unlike the proposal to create 20,000 more prison places, there are no clear costings, programmes or timing for many of the positive proposals to support rehabilitation. They're often expressed as part of a 10-year or long-term vision. Without the strategy and investment, I'm afraid the white paper risks becoming a white elephant. So what? So if we're getting it wrong in terms of who's going to prison, why they're going to prison, what prison can do, what could we do instead? We are at real risk, and Lucia mentioned it, of treating prisons and criminal justice as a sort of capacious social service, something that can scoop up people that other departments, whether that's the Department of Health, Department for Local Government, who are expensive, challenging and vulnerable, and who end up in prison by default, because the other services don't exist. The prison service essentially is the bank that can't say no. A mental health unit can and often will refuse to accept someone with severe mental health problems. Schools can exclude children. Social services can't manage what happens afterwards. But prisons have to accept whoever's sent with the court. And if I'm looking at some of the cases that we've dealt with, a woman with acquired brain injury who was so ill that she was in segregation for over 2 years because she was too expensive to be dealt with outside in the community. Nobody wanted her, in spite of the Independent Monitoring Board banging on, and finally she was moved on. I remember a young person I talked to who was kept on getting into segregation and who said, "Miss, all my life I've been passed around like a parcel." That previous experience, which is what has led people there. We know about the disproportionality as well. We know that people from black and ethnic minority communities are more likely to end up in prison. When in prison, they're more likely to end up in segregation. They're more likely to have force used against them. They're more likely to be on the lowest level of privileges in prison. So if prison is the answer to some of those things, we're simply not asking the right question. There was some work done on justice reinvestment in the early years of this century. There was investment in things like Sure Start, for example, for children. There was investment in women's centres as an alternative for women in prison. I have seen in 20 years of dealing with this so many pilots. I can't tell you how many, but sadly they very rarely get out of harbour. They are experiments that are never allowed time to see whether they work or not. And working isn't an instant fix. We're talking about people whose lives might need an awful lot of reinvestment in order to make sure that they can live the kind of life that they actually want to live. So my answer, my idea, and it is not new, and Lucia's already mentioned it, and I talked about it when I was inspecting prisons, is we have to invest in not prison. We have to have a holistic approach which involves all parts of society in trying to work out and stop what gets people to prison in the first place, but also what happens next. What happens next shouldn't be sleeping on somebody's settee. What happens next shouldn't be wandering around trying to find mental health support or trying to find support with addiction. We need to invest in early years. We need to invest in mental health support in the community. When we closed the big mental hospitals, we promised care in the community. Sadly, we got care such as it is in custody. We've got to invest in social services and childcare. We've got to invest in accommodation afterwards. During COVID, we had this plan of no one being homeless. Why couldn't we carry it on after COVID? We had a report on women in prison by Baroness Corsten in the early years of this century, and yet now we're creating 500 more prison places for women. So we have got, if we really want to solve this, we have got to invest. We've not got to see criminal justice and prisons in particular as being the answer. They're not. They're the problem. We've got to have a dialogue with the public. And that dialogue has to be, what outcome do you want? What do you want to happen for yourself, for your communities, and for those people who are often on the margins of your community? Maybe a Royal Commission. We've never had those for ages. We're not going to have them again. But something of that nature that actually looks at the whole thing from beginning to end.
Good morning. Matt kindly referred to my book, which, this is not a book plug, I don't think you can get it anymore, but that was in 2011. It was Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Why Britain's Prisons Are Failing. I'm not about to write the sequel, because it's too much like hard work, but it would be Still Out of Sight, Still Out of Mind, Why Britain's Prisons Are Still Failing. And you don't need to listen to me pontificate about that. We have an excellent Chief Inspector of Prisons, and I'm glad to see we have an excellent Chief Inspector of Probation. Read their reports, read their thematics, and this is not to say there are not good probation officers, that there are not good prison governors, that there are not some heroes and heroines out there really doing some excellent work, but the system is fundamentally broken and has been for some time. Now, how do we change that? And this is the Festival Ideas, so I'm going to throw in some ideas. We do look quite rightly to reducing the population, prison population. We do look to more money. But I just ask you to look at the criminal justice policies of the Labour government, were it to get in power, and that of the current government. I know there's much of a fag paper between them. They're still out-toughing each other. They're still coming out with the same rhetoric. None of them are going to significantly reduce the prison population, and they're certainly not going to put any money. So how do we change things? Now, in all the debates and discussions around prisons, prisons are, in a sense, seen as the victims in all this. And I want to suggest to you, they are actually perpetrators. Because one of the problems, the conclusions I've come to after far too long, is the big issue is about the culture of what used to be the prison service. It's now the culture of the prison and probation service. So let's not forget we have His Majesty's prison and probation service. And we might want to talk in the discussion session about how that came about. I, in the early days, thought, yes, it was possibly a marriage made in heaven. It was a forced marriage, I think, in reality. And I think now it's a broken marriage. And I think culturally what happened was that the prison and probation services were not merged. The prison service annexed the probation service. I have no doubt about that. And I put in my book, I learned a lot of my trade from probation officers. I was a junior trainee assistant governor. I didn't know really what I joined, but I met some wonderful probation officers who taught me about prisons and people. And there was a culture there of helping, and the term was used in befriending. And I think by the time the prison service had got its hands on the probation service, it had turned it more into a community police force and not a particularly good police force. So, festival ideas, how do we change that? Well, I will suggest three things. One, first and most important, that the probation service splits from the prison service. I think NAPO are talking about that as a policy. We can talk in the question and answer session about transforming rehabilitation, the grayling changes and all of that. Grayling, I'm no defender of grayling, but it wasn't Grayling's idea. That was the prison service's idea. That was a failure. But I think, I've done some work in Scotland where we talk of community-based social workers, prison-based social workers. I think that's the way forward because, if we're addressing some of the drivers, the drivers to reduce the population are within the hands of the prison and probation service, and it's about reducing reoffending. It's about successful resettlement. But we come to the prison service itself, and we talk about this large sort of body. I've worked in it. I've disagreed with it. It's been part of my life for years. It is a one-size-fits-all. It is inward-looking. I, as a prison governor, in a sense, was in a culture whereby I had to look inwards and upwards, and certainly when I was at Brixton, I was looking outwards, and that was not well received. Prison governors should be working with their local communities. Who's in prison? Members of the community passing through, and all but about 60 of the 85,000 are going to be released. So almost everyone's coming out. So they're going to be your and my neighbours. So I think it's important that the prison system works with communities. Now, at the moment, because it's a behemoth, it's one size fits all, it's very top down, it's very managerialist. The number of managerial tiers above a governor you wouldn't believe. So my second suggestion is that we split up the prison service. Now, I'm not a great one for reorganisation, and you can see in the health service that reorganisation can be a pain rather than a success. But, who's in prison, members of the community passing through? Who should we be locking up? People we're frightened of, not mad at. Of the 85,000 who really need the form of custody that is being created in Fossway and Five Wells, these Titan prisons, yes. Probably of that 85,000, I would say maybe about 30,000 need that kind of containment. Of that 85,000, such is the turnover, something like 60,000 prisoners a year are being released. So a large percentage of the prison population is quite close to release. isn't worried about escaping because there's nowhere to go. It's about getting them into... Locking people up is easy. I've done it for 20-odd years. Getting them out, that's the tricky bit, and that's what we're not good at. So what I think we need is a traditional prison system that we have at the moment, centralist, top-down, security-focused, and that's, if you like, kind of federal estate, for long-termers, people serving long sentences, people at the beginning of long sentences. But I would devolve the remaining parts of the estate to the local communities, be it local mayors, be it police and crime commissioners. And I know that's probably a bit controversial because I'm sure within policing there are lots of views about, but I don't really care. But again, you think of lots of the drivers that Anne was talking about, you know, about mental health and about revolving door. Where are those solutions? Those solutions are within the communities that people came from and are going to. You know, they're not in the kind of remit of a prison service obsessed with culture. You know, we can talk about certain cases. I mean, I work closely with the inquest on Usman Khan, and we can talk about the failure of the prison and probation service, as well as the security services. Everybody failed Jack and Saskia in that. But fundamental to that was a culture of incarceration. No, Usman Khan was coming out after 9 years. What was done with him? No, he was kept as a high-risk Category A, one of only 30 prisoners in the country, till the day he was released. And that was because the prison service were not prepared to take any risk, were not prepared to do their job. The job of the prison service is not just to lock people up, it's to get people out such that they don't come back. So for me, we have a divorce of the prison and probation service. We put the probation service much more to local authorities, and we split the prison and probation service into a federal estate dealing with, you know, long-term secure containment on the one hand, and we talked about community prisons over the years, much more locally focused community prisons where the drivers and the solutions and the problems, particularly revolving door, are working much more closely and much more intimately with the communities that prisons are there to serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'll ask a couple of questions and then move over. So I guess the first question I've got is a general one about, and perhaps the best way to put this is, when I was a student, so we're going back a very, very long time, I organised a series of talks. I'm clearly a repeat offender for organising talks. And I met a very lively and thrusting young shadow minister called Tony Blair. And I had the chance to talk to him before his speech. And he said, look, what we do doesn't work. The evidence is overwhelming. We know that what we do doesn't work. We need to change things. We need to... And the second of those speakers was the then Chief Inspector of Prisons, Stephen Tumin, who just produced a report saying what we do doesn't work. It was a report called Using Time, Not Doing Time. And that would have been in the early 90s, let's say. So we've known the evidence. We've known a lot of things don't work. We've known we over-criminalise. Our politicians, John Major, as Dame Anne said, just gave a speech in which he said, you know, I wish I'd done more because I know that the evidence was the way it was. So to get to the question, sorry, I mean, the question is, in a sense, why is this area of public policy so evidence insensitive? I mean, is it, you know, as Lucia in a way was suggesting that our public conception of crime is different from thinking of it as a kind of regulatory public policy that should just be evaluated by whether it works in very, very sort of ordinary public policy terms? Is it that somehow or other there's a gap between the kinds of things we're outraged about and what our politicians are responsive to? But it is, I mean, it must be, for all of you, it must be so immensely frustrating that this is an area where we do have good evidence of what works. People know what works, people know what doesn't work, and we continue to do it. So I wonder whether I could ask you to reflect on that. Perhaps starting with you, Joanna, why do you think people aren't outraged? I mean, you gave us stories that you would think would make fantastic tabloid stories. You'd think that they would rile up precisely the kinds of voters the parties care about. You know, a rape victim who has to wait a year and is then told to wait another year. Why do you think people are not? Is it that it's out of sight, out of mind? What is it that makes this not a national scandal? Because it is a national scandal, as you made clear.
I think that criminals and people accused of being criminals are quite easy points to score if you're in a sticky political spot. And whilst when the sea is calm, or when someone is out of office, it's very easy to say the more nuanced position, which is something we appear to all share. But when you're a politician and you've got something brewing, and you need to climb those points, you need to get those voting figures up. Keeping rapists in prison for 3 years longer, which achieves exactly nothing. If someone sits in prison for 9 years or sits in prison for 12 years, they're coming out exactly the same. That 3 years is not doing anything except making the public feel better. Because we quite like vengeance, we quite like retribution. We do, we all like it. If you read that someone's done something wrong and they've been really punished for it, there's a natural feeling in us of satisfaction there. And I think the other purposes of punishment take a little bit of adjustment for human beings. To think of rehabilitation takes intellectual effort, to think of the long game rather than the instant retribution when a crime has been committed. And so I think the answer to your question is that when the seas are calm and when there's money in the bank, it's all well and good to talk a good game. But the truth is, once a politician gets into office and the waters get a bit choppy, introducing the abolishment, for example, of sentences under 2 years, abolish them. If the figure is reached by a judge of 23 months in prison, have the courage and the confidence to say the only thing we're doing to this person is making them worse. The only thing we're doing here is making them more likely to offend, because they're going to lose their house, they're going to lose their wife, they're going to lose their job, they're going to lose their dignity, and those factors are all driving factors for reoffending. And we're doing that on purpose, which is a mad thing to do, but we're doing it because it looks good in the Daily Mail. Having the confidence and the courage and the money to do that, I think, is extinguished very quickly when people get into office.
Yeah.
Can I come in? I agree with you that we're all vengeful to varying degrees, but actually some colleagues of mine did some really interesting research where they asked people, do you think the criminal justice system is punitive enough? To which they answered, no, it needs to be much tougher. Then what they did was they gave people little vignettes, little stories. Joe's aged 12. He's stolen from 2 bars of chocolate from a shop. What do you think his sentencing level should be? And then they'd give them 5 options. And so on, those kinds of stories, and much more serious crimes as well. What they found, interestingly, was that when given those little stories, the people actually responded with sentencing levels which were more or less, curiously and almost kind of, implausibly, almost exactly either at current sentencing levels or rather lower. So you might think there isn't actually necessarily the public opinion that's pushing politicians, that the politicians believe in, and some of that's coming from the press. But when my colleagues then tried to present these findings to government ministers, they just didn't want to hear, because it didn't fit with the rhetoric of punitiveness and the easy wins that could come, as you've rightly said, out of promising to be even tougher on crime.
And what often happens, sadly, is that there is one horrible case.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be one horrible case every year, every few months. And on the back of that, there's the something must be done rhetoric. And that's how we got indeterminate sentences for public protection. That's precisely how we got it. It's irrespective of what Tony Blair said to you in the 1990s. It was under his government that something had to be done, and that something was locking people up because they might commit another offence in the future. So you've always got that pressure, and people, and that's responded to. The other thing is, the other bit of what you were saying, Joanna, is yes, I absolutely short sentences do no good at all. But if not a short prison sentence, then what? Because there's got to be something else, because that person is in a bad way in their life, and we've got to invest in something else. And part of the problem is prisons are cheap. Compared with the kind of investment that you would have to make for people who, has got a someone's got a long-term learning disability, someone who has had a long process of addiction, who's survived trauma in their childhood. other services really, really don't want to know.
I mean, I think the cheapness bit is really relevant. I mean, one of the problems with prison is the backstop. But if you were a local authority or a mayor or whoever, and you had the budget for your local prison, actually it becomes quite expensive. So if you're there managing that prison and the social services and the education and the mental health, if you're managing the totality of that, then you have an incentive as a local authority not to send to prison or to pick up the consequences of sending someone to prison. Money talks. I've gone as far as saying that judges should have the budgets for disposals. Judges, magistrates, they can toss out whatever sentence they want and they will die in a ditch to maintain that right. But, judges, they're the only people I know who have no financial consequences for the decisions they made. And that's part of the problem with the Courts of the Prison Service. It's this behemoth, and it doesn't pick up the consequences for its actions. But, other people are. So, I go back to my devolution thing. But the other thing in terms of the outrage is secrecy. I like to think, when I was running prisons, I metaphorically opened the doors. But, you talk to any journalist, they can't get into prison, they can't report stories. There's no group of people I've ever sort of brought into any of my prisons that haven't come out either now they have a view, and the view is, and they've met and they've spoken to prisoners. 26 years running prisons, I've shown 2 judges around my jails. I rest my case.
I think you're absolutely right, John, on the devolution point, belonging to the community. I think it's absolutely right. But I think that would involve another shift in public policy, which is to re-empower local authorities. Because at the moment, local authorities have very little power except to empty the dustbins. I mean, they control amazingly little. So that would have to be in the context of devolving other things, like, as you say, mental health and social
but there's lots of talk about devolution, but not a lot of action. I would see this as part of it.
Exactly.
So how, I mean, do you think there is a problem with just, in a sense, public education? And that's not to sound condescending about the general public, but I mean, prisons have largely moved out of towns, and it's not entirely the case. Magistrates' courts, are misunderstood, I think, and as Lucia was saying, the general conception of what the criminal justice system is for and so on. Is that where part of the problem comes, that we've got a problem that the voters, in a sense, have a sort of conception of what it's about. Politicians are responsive to that conception and drive it in lots of ways, and actually all the nuance and evidence is just falling through the middle. Oh, okay. Don't just nod.
not helped by the fact that we had a absolutely brilliant 40-person research unit within the Home Office, within government, which was abolished. So now we have as an academic, a really crazy expensive system where academics have to bid for funding, try and get grants, have to try and get access to prisons and so on. It used to be the case that there were 40-odd people doing research commissioned by the government within the government who automatically had the funding and the access and so on. So the quality of first-line research, I think, has both gone down and got more expensive.
So I'll ask one more question, and then open up the audience.
Can I ask one question to the panel?
Certainly.
No,
go ahead.
No, it's just that I'm just worrying about something which I can't answer, but maybe you guys can. So, Joanna, you really talked about. Sorry, I'm usurping your role.
We've known each other a long time. So.
But you talked about the backlog in the court system and the burden. I mean, really awful burdens it must place on witnesses, on victims, on defendants. 2 questions. One is the government, I think, has a target to get the backlog down by March of next year to 53,000 cases in the Crown Court. I mean, is that enough? Is it soon enough? What's realistic? But then I got worried about the fact that if you put more money in and you have a more efficient court system, are we going to end up sending more people to prison and overburdening the prison system?
So the entire thing is an ecosystem. Yeah. And so if I'm in court losing, which I do, and people are getting convicted, then the prison population is going up. But if we're waiting, there are people held on remand, people unconvicted who are taking up remand places. So they are going up if they're waiting for their trial. But then when they reach trial, they might be going down. And so the whole thing is a consistent balancing act around the country. We are fast approaching, and recently there has been case law in the Court of Appeal, the place where prisons are full. And they have got in their back pocket a plan to utilise cells in police stations.
It's not in the back pocket, it's very much in the front pocket. It's happening right now.
And we, Dame Anna, in court now, if you have somebody who is on the cusp of a custodial sentence, it is perfectly legitimate for a lawyer like me to say, well, the prisons are full. And of all the arguments I advance in front of all of the judges, the fact that we haven't got our act together to have room for people who do deserve to be in prison, and that I'm allowed to stand there and go, well, it's a bit crowded, isn't it? Let's let them go home. That isn't the most legitimate argument that, as a lawyer, you necessarily feel comfortable advancing. And so Dame Anne's quite right. We're at breaking point, and that is due to a few reasons. It's not just the backlog. It's the fact that the government thought it was a great idea to abolish halfway release for lots of offences. Now, halfway release has become this sort of like devil in the room where people go, it'll only serve half. It'll only serve half of that. As if at halfway, people just sort of like skip off into the sunset, free as a bird. The truth is that if you take somebody into prison, if any of you got taken into prison for years, and some of my clients are serving sentences well into double figures, and you're going to be released into society. As one of the other panellists was saying earlier, these people are going to be our neighbours. They're going to be our citizens, as John was saying. It needs a structured return. You can't just kick somebody out of the door of HMP Belmarsh and say, well, best of luck. And so it really needs a recalibration in how we view the release provisions and what we do and the work we do and the supervision and the reintroduction to society, because I think people would genuinely think that was a good thing. But it almost feels like we've lost that argument. It's almost so far down the tracks now that we're going to keep people in prison for longer and longer and longer. And of course, we're full. There's no room at the inn.
Yeah. John.
But again, we get back to this phrase I use that, you know, the prison and probation service are kind of the victims here. Poor old prison probation service, because they're being sent lots of prisoners. At the other end, it is the responsibility of the prisoners to get people out. And a very good example at the moment is home detention curfew, which you will probably think of, it's tagging. So basically, you're serving a sentence of 3 months to 4 years, relatively minor offences. I'm not diminishing any offending. But you can get out, I think, they've extended to about 180 days before the end of your sentence if you've got somewhere to live. Now, the current extension, I think, is going to release about another 400 people. But lost in the weeds of all of that are the statistics. And this is governors who are granting home detention curfew. And they're working with probation staff to find prisoners somewhere to live so they can get out towards the end of their sentence with somewhere to live. Now, the stats I don't know, I mean, I did look at them just before I left. The interesting stat is, of those who are eligible for home detention curfew, how many get it? And when I looked at it many, many years ago, it was about 20%. So the remainder didn't get out early, but they still got out. So at the end, you know, 180 days further down the line, have you got somewhere to live? No, you're still going out. So, you know, the onus then, I'm sorry, this is the role of the prison probation service. Fine, and it's not easy, I know, homes, rents, all this, that and the other, but it's about finding somewhere to live, you know, and, you know, I mean, you know, Justin will know better than I, you know, are enough probation officers out there? Are they interacting as closely as they can, as close as they should to find that accommodation? You look at the parole system, you know, the parole system is there, and the parole system is pretty good, despite what Raab and all those are attacking of. It's not bad. I think it's something we should be proud of. But again, it is the role of the prison and the probation service to prepare prisoners for their parole review, to have the right reports in the right place, have the report at the right time, and if the parole board consider that someone is safe to be released, they move them out. So, I mean, there are a whole raft of things at that other end. Yes, it's coming in, and yeah, poor old prison service, you take what you get. But at the other end, you know, I'm not sure they're as efficient and focused as they should be, because, as you know, culturally, while they're providing nothing happens when they're in prison, nothing to do with us. When they're released, well, yeah, nothing to do with us. Maybe the probation service will get a bit of a kick in, but you know, their role is locking people up and getting people out, and the getting people out is as important to reducing the population as all those issues about the backlog, of course.
But also, I'd say, in relation to what you were saying, Joanne, absolutely. I mean, for particularly people who've been in prison for a long time, you need a transition. Now, we've got a system for that. They're called open prisons. And they are places where people go, usually at the end of a long sentence, where they can, after a time, they can work outside the prison, they can spend time with their families, they can do that readjustment. I remember talking to somebody in a prison, a life sentence prison, who'd been in prison for a long while, and he'd been on one of these trips. This must be 10-15 years ago. And I said, what was it like? And he said, do you know what I noticed, miss? The colour of umbrellas. They're not all black. And that's the sort of transition people are doing. That's what our open prisons are for, used to be for. Because the previous Secretary of State took upon himself the decision to decide whether people should go to open prisons or not. And before he took that decision, 94% of those recommended to go to open prisons, most of them serving long sentences, therefore serious offences, 94% were accepted and off they went to open prisons. Once Minister made the decision, 87% were refused because he looked at the index offence, and the index offence was pretty serious. So open prisons are now being used simply as a pressure valve for people on short sentences close to release, and not for the purpose that they were intended, precisely because of a ministerial decision. And there's still a bill before Parliament where the Minister is going to take upon himself the decision to decide on release, not the parole board, but the Minister. And ministers are inevitably risk averse. Of course they are. We would all be if we were ministers and it was down to us individually. That's why you have courts. That's why you have the parole board. That's why you have judicial systems. And the more that we make this a political decision, the more risk averse it's going to be.
And that's a very dangerous precedent. I mean, you remember, 20 years ago, it was the Home Secretary, as it was then, who made the decision on tariffs. So you're sentenced to life imprisonment. The tariff, the minimum you would serve, was set by the Home Secretary. That was quite rightly challenged in the courts, and it's now to the trial judge and the Lord Chief Justice, and that's quite right. We are very, very close to politicians deciding incarceration or otherwise. Now that is even more dangerous than IPP, which was imprisoning people for what they might do, not what they've done. We are on a bit of a precipice here, I think, politically.
Right, I'm going to open up. The very important part of the festival is to open up to the audience. So please wait for the microphone to come, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions, so please keep your questions single question and relatively short. So, lady in the front. And please put your hands up so I can...
Thank you. Viv Lever. In the 80s and 90s, I worked for 20 years in open and secure prisons when restorative justice was a thing that was being developed. To what extent is that part of release programmes now?
The short answer is not at all, really. There's still talk about it in some prisons, and some individual governors have tried to do a lot of work on it, but it's one of those things that isn't part of the...
It's crazy, because it was never... I mean, I'm a great fan, and I ran some RJ projects at Brixton. I think it is particularly good for a lot of victims. It has closure for a lot of victims. But it's one of these things, again, it's this insularity of the prison service. Because the prison service didn't come up with it, it's because of its insularity. It should have been adopted nationally as a principle and series of programmes from the prison service. But it's not. There's a few charities out there, a few organisations who are knocking on the door saying we would like to do it, because we talk about evidence. The evidence is there, and I've seen some prisoners fundamentally changed by RGA. But it's not for everybody. But it should be there. But there are the good old sex offender treatment programme, which is, shall we say, controversial, for which if there is any evidence for it, it can actually make people worse. But that's homegrown and is sacred to the prison service. Again, it's about its insularity. There's a real opportunity there for RJ, but the prison service don't want to take it.
Great, the gentleman there.
I and my wife have been providing supported lodgings for refugees here in York, UASC, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, for the last 6 years. And a couple of years ago, a couple of them were arrested by appointment, in other words, invited by the police to come to the police station. I accompanied them, and I was pretty appalled at how they were treated. by a frontline uniformed police officer who clearly found this exciting, that people were likely to be charged with rape. He'd never done anything as major before. 5 hours later, I got a more senior CID person on the phone who, in coded terms, admitted they had been racist. I'm curious, in terms of not just where you think racism and other things, feature in the criminal justice system, but also in terms of how we define crime, coming back to our first speaker, and cultural norms and all those sorts of things. Equality, diversity, inclusion, where are we on those things in relation to defining law?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll have a go. The very simple answer is extremely poor. And not only in the conduct of our serving officers, and some forces, police forces, have had to admit to institutional racism, which I find a problematic term, because whilst it's an admission that the whole institution of the police force is institutionally racist, I always worry that that then somehow absolves individuals from their own conduct. But we also create a lot of offences which are targeted at particular categories of people, which are in themselves arguably racialised. And one very obvious area is the criminalisation of a lot of immigration offences. So I'm just give you one example from the Nationality and Borders Act, which passed very recently. It's now simply to arrive on our shores, even before one presents oneself to an immigration officer, by an irregular route, is a criminal offence with up to 17 years prison sentence and automatically deportable. So somebody who comes, as nearly all asylum seekers do, come by irregular routes, that is, they don't get permission to make the journey in advance, who historically would have presented their case to an immigration officer at Heathrow or at Dover or whatever, cannot do that, because the minute they put their foot on the tarmac, they've already committed a serious criminal offence. That's just one example. I could go on for hours about others, so we need to look at not only at the individuals who are carrying out and exercising discretion in the criminal justice system, but also the very laws that they're having to operate.
So, since Lucia usurped my role as a chair, I shall usurp a role as a panellist and just say a few words, because I think, you're right. Please come back for the second session, which is on policing, where we'll be looking directly at questions of policing and racism in the police. But your question about, criminalisation choices having effects is immensely important. Lucia gave an example. I'll just give you another one, because it shows that criminal justice is not something that has to be. It is a choice we make. I have a very good friend who's an African-American criminal lawyer, criminal law theorist in the United States, and he wrote an extraordinarily powerful editorial about the difference between the response to the crack cocaine epidemic and the opioid epidemic. When the crack cocaine epidemic happened, it was clamped down on through the criminal justice system. Massively high sentences, massive numbers of people sent to prison, massive numbers of people sent to prison for life without parole. It happened in the African-American community. When the opioid epidemic, which is happening now, is primarily happening in the white community, the response was not a criminal justice response, the response was a public health response. How do we fix this? How do we treat this as a public health problem? And the reason I interrupt is I think that's an immensely powerful example, not just of the particular instance of racism or the racial elements of criminalization, but of the way in which we don't have to think of things as criminal problems. There are other ways to think about things, and all the panelists have mentioned, welfare, mental health, etc., etc. There are so many other issues here than just the default response of criminalize it and put them in prison. And that's just a very powerful example. I promise I'll shut up. God. Lady there, just wait for the microphone, please.
I was wondering how prison-based or criminal discrimination in hiring practices affects community-based rehabilitation, and how that differs for violent and non-violent offenders. My question is, what, in your experience, is the efficacy of eliminating that discrimination in hiring?
I mean, the biggest problem at the moment in prisons for anyone working in prisons, they're not nice places to work, be it specialists, be it prison officers. I mean, they don't have a good reputation. I didn't make reference to a statement made by Charlie Taylor, Chief Inspector of Prisons. During COVID, a decision was made, and we could talk about that endlessly, to lock people up so that COVID wasn't spread. So we had, for 2 years, mass solitary confinement in our prisons. And I think Charlie was reluctant to use the term solitary confinement. He does now, because that's what it is. And solitary confinement for more than, I think, 8 or 10 days in succession is, according to the Mandela rules, definition of torture. And what Charlie said was, since COVID, the prison service is now in what's called a post-COVID torpor. And again, you see it in his reports, people are not getting out of their cells to be involved with anything, be it in any kind of program, any form of interaction, be that with prison officers, be that with specialists. And I think there are people who will look at the system from any kind of background and say, can they change that? Can they knock on the door? Can they get to do what they want to do, which is work with people? And I think the prison service is becoming increasingly less of a people-based organisation. I'm not sure I'm answered the question there, but I mean, it's not a good place to work.
Did you mean the employment of prison officers or the employment of ex-offenders? Okay, so this is...
Oh, sorry, I missed that in terms of... yes, I mean, there has been a culture of not employing ex-offenders. I mean, certainly there are ex-offenders within, or we say, with lived experience. There are drug and alcohol service providers are using people with lived experience. I think the Probation Service, is now taking on... Prison service is nowhere, I've met some good people with lived experience who would make great heads of security in a prison, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. It's a cultural thing. I go back to the culture. I work with a charity, working with ex-offenders, going to universities, and some of them have had placements in the Home Office. Some of them have had placements in the Ministry of Justice. Getting a placement in a prison, no, it's cultural.
And can I say that when ex-offenders are employed and they do turn their lives around, the public love it. If you look at the Timpson story and the people employed there and the pride they take in having a job, in working hard, in providing a good service and building skills and either staying in that business or utilising those skills elsewhere, that story captures the public heart. And so for the life of me, I never understand why we haven't been able to marry up the transformation of people who have offended with our obsession and addiction to seemingly locking them up for longer and longer. And so I think that there is scope there to really, for somebody, to capture electorally at the ballot box a different approach.
One of my ex-students went to the criminal bar, had a very successful career, chucked it in, set up a micro brewery, which only employs ex-offenders. It's called Criminally Good Beer, by the way. And
available at all good shops.
Yeah, available in all good shops. And it's been massively successful, and people love it, and people, it now has outlets everywhere, and that's, this is another. It's following the Timpson model of actually giving people a chance.
Yeah, and a lot of prisons run programs or jobs in the community, so do look into it. I mean, a prison local to us. They run a bike restoration scheme, and the people who are imprisoned are quite literally repairing bikes, shipping them out, and they take such pride in the work, and the local community really uses the service. We also eat at restaurants that are run by prisoners, and the kitchens and the preparation. So do, just in your local communities, look into it, because it's such a good thing to support.
Would any of you close
there is so little. I mean, if we started investing in that, you know, and it always depends on sort of charitable funds. I mean, if we relied upon charitable funds to run our prisons, you know, they'd close. So it's a sort of nice add-on in a way. And I think what everyone has said, and John and others, it needs to be the central focus of what you're doing.
I mean,
is what happens next.
There is something called New Futures Network, which you might want to have a look at, you know, which was set up to try and broker that relationship between local business and prisons. I mean, when I were a lad, you know, back in a long time ago, getting prisons employment, well, they're taking away the jobs of the local community. Now, it's kind of turned on its head. You know, organisations are looking for employees. So, you know, so the situation is rife now for actually getting people into employment. Whether it's actually happening, I'm kind of not so sure. You know, there's some stats out there. I'd like to think there was a real opportunity. I'd like to think there's more of it, but, you know, I remain to be convinced.
Would you change the disclosure rules?
Yeah. Knock them right in the head.
Short question, short answer. A gentleman there.
How can we reduce the influence of politicians on sentencing, prisons, probation?
Well, I said I wasn't an abolitionist, but I think I am as far as some of the politicians go. I mean, I've worked with Straw and Blunkett. I have to say, and people might start throwing things at me if I whisper this very, very quietly, one of the best Secretaries of State for Justice I came across was Michael Gove. I think he got it. And he wasn't there long enough. But again, it's kind of quite easy. You know, Grayling gets blamed for everything, and Raab gets blamed for everything. But while they're changing, like we change our socks, you know, the hierarchy and the culture of the prison, primarily the prison and probation services, has been static for about 2 decades. And there's been no cross-fertilisation. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, I've worked with a lot of drug and alcohol services charities, met some great people in that field. Now, none of them running some big charities, delivering services, none of them have ever gone into the prison and probation service to be responsible managerially and within the hierarchy for delivering those into prisons, because they're not interested, they're not encouraged, they wouldn't get in, and they probably wouldn't like it for very long. So we don't get that cross-fertilisation. You know, and ministers are yes-ministered all the time. You know, I mean, Alex Chalk's in now. He'll say a few words. He's gone in so many months. You know, by the time he gets his feet under the table, it's this minister, it's that minister, and, you know, he doesn't know what his punch board account or something, but he's not going to make any difference. Primarily, they're not there long enough, and they don't come with the skills and competencies for the job. No minister comes with any skills and any competence for any job.
Okay, yeah, please, and then I'll come to the...
So given...
No, just behind you.
Sorry.
Can you hear me? I don't know if this is actually a question, but I'm just jumping back to the lady who first mentioned restorative practice. Where, I don't know if any of the panel can answer or anybody in the audience, but where are we at with restorative practice schools and trauma-informed schools in relation to trying in a way to develop some form of compassion rather than some understanding of... this isn't really a question, is it? I don't know, it's more of an observation. It's more of an observation that where are we at with trauma-informed practices rather than just, you know, criminalisation. We've got particularly...
Well, it goes what Anne mentioned earlier on, which was early intervention. You know, the best way of reducing the prison population is to start with single mothers or pregnant mothers, or, you know, go back and back and back and back, and particularly into schools, and starts, you know, it's that old, was it Desmond Tutu, you know, we should stop fishing people out the stream, we should go upstream and find out why they're falling in. You know, and I think... Actually saying is that I'm agreeing with that, having worked in early years, schools, having had, I can say this very openly, a father with addictions, was he was traumatised from early childhood. So where are we looking at? Generational trauma.
Exactly. I mean, and you can make a direct path between children who avoided or were avoided by education, who are excluded or truanted. There's a direct track between them and criminal justice, and it shouldn't be. We need to invest at that stage. Again, you were talking about evidence. We've got loads of evidence that that's what you need to do.
But trauma-informed is beginning to come in prison, and it's being dragged kicking and screaming into being trauma-informed. It's being dragged kicking and screaming, particularly within the women's estate, where it is most appropriate. But it's still there to get in. But I mean, the whole trauma-informed issue is relatively new. But I do think this is something the prison service ought to grasp, and it's not properly grasped yet, as far as I'm aware.
And also policing. I mean, there's a lot of interest amongst the police in public health approaches to crime, even up to and including things like serious knife crime.
Yes. I'm just going to change the cue slightly for our photographers, indicated just to follow up on this particular point.
So you'd actually said, asking if anyone in the audience could answer. My wife's a teacher herself, and you're asking basically where we're up to with restorative practice within schools. It does exist. It's not consistent in different schools. That's what I found.
I'm going to, sorry to interrupt.
Shall we chat after?
Yeah, we've got 3 questions and we've got 7 minutes. So I'm going to take the 3 questions. Please keep them short, and then invite the panelists to answer whichever. So we'll start with the gentleman there. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Going back to your point about change and seeing that it's not red and it's not blue and it's not coalition colours and all this sort of thing, and it's not Minister A and it's not Minister B, is it perhaps the underlying civil service structure with Sir Humphrey syndrome or whatever you want to call it?
Okay, thank you. And then the lady there. I think.
Just going back to what you said at the start, really, about the system itself not working or not being fit for purpose, can we ever add trauma-informed on top of a system that doesn't work? Or is it possible to keep adding these things onto a system if the system itself is broken?
Great. And then at the front, Justin.
Justin Russell, I'm the Chief Inspector of Probation. You can hear a bit more from me this afternoon, but we've been focusing on adults this morning, and just to end on a slightly more positive note, if you look at the youth justice system, you do see a very different story over the past 10 or 20 years. The youth custody population has come down from about 3,500 in the mid-2000s to not much over 500 now. The number of court cases involving young people is down by about 80 or 90% in 10 years. Far fewer young people being arrested. A massive shift into much more informal ways of dealing with children who get involved in crime. And our inspections of youth justice services are actually quite positive. They have reasonable caseloads. They have embedded speech and language workers. They have embedded CAMS workers. They have a strong connection with education. So I think there are lessons to be learned. They've sort of under the radar, in spite of a Conservative government for the last 12 years, we've seen some quite profound changes in youth justice that I think could hold out a lot of lessons actually for the adult system that we've been talking about.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to open it up. We've got 5 minutes, so I'll give you a chance to reply or add anything you want to, and we'll go in the order we've started in.
Okay. Well, I have a question back for you, but you can answer it this afternoon, which is what lessons could the rest of the criminal justice system learn from what's been achieved in youth justice? Because those figures are really, really impressive. But I'm just struck by your use of the term under the radar. And I was at a workshop on Friday where people were talking about stealth tactics. Stealth gardening in London, where you take kind of derelict places and you throw wildflower seeds down and watch what happens. And I'm wondering whether that's what we need in criminal justice, is kind of stealth tactics where you do things and you don't tell anybody, you don't issue a press release, you don't inform the public, you just do it. And maybe it could flourish like the wildflowers.
Just from the point of youths in the criminal justice system, I completely agree with you. Youths that are treated as youths and often in the youth court or in diversions, the system is working well. There is a category of youths, though, that I'm troubled by, and there are youths that end up in the adult court. either by virtue of being jointly charged with an adult, which happens more often than we should be comfortable with, or secondly, because the crime is so serious. I've recently finished an attempted murder trial, a double attempted murder trial involving 4 or 5 16 and 17-year-olds. They were held at HMP Wetherby, up here. The trial was in Cambridge, and the closest we could get them to their trial, where they were travelling each day on a van, was Feltham in West London, which in the rush hour, and if you're 17 and you're accused of a double attempted murder, is not the best start to the morning for a trial that lasts 4 weeks. And so we do treat children well in the system, but we also treat them badly. And so I think that category, and it is thankfully a small category, but they often ended up in my lap, with a lot to do.
Can I just say, when you say travelled in a van, they're really fast, travelled in a van. Howard Lee once made me do this. Think upright coffin.
Yeah.
I'll put you in a van next. Right.
Yeah, okay, the 3 questions. First of all, in relation to trauma, do it earlier, because prison traumatises. Okay, so you're going to re-traumatise people who've already been traumatised, so do it earlier. In relation to the civil service is now much more scared than it used to be. Civil servants used to be able to confront ministers with uncomfortable truths. People like David Faulkner, whom Lucia, I think I first met you, Lucia, at one of David's seminars, were able to not just to say yes, minister, but to say but, minister. You don't get very far on the civil service now if you do that. And the combination of that and special advisors, I think, has made a huge difference. Justin, you're absolutely right about youth custody, and I could have said that actually that's a trend in exactly the other direction. But my problem is not just what Joanna said, but what happens to somebody when you blow out the candles on your 18th birthday cake? You end up in the prison. We're now closing our specific young adult prisons. They're all closing. They're all just becoming normal prisons. So that horrible cut-off, when you haven't got that support, when you haven't got social work support, you haven't got therapeutic support, and just because you're 18, I mean, I may be a terrible parent, but I don't think any of my kids, when they reached 18, were suddenly fully formed, functional adults who went off and never made any mistakes ever again. So we've got to do something about that 18 to 25 age group, who are troublesome and troubled in prisons, and who it's worth investing in.
Dysfunctional governments create a dysfunctional civil service, and I think that's where we're at. In terms of youth justice, I think that's absolutely right for us to be reminded of that, but I just throw in Charlie Taylor's report on Cook and Wood, £240,000 per child per year for solitary confinement. That's a disgrace. And in terms of superimposition, I think we turned it on its head. I think you're absolutely right, but what we should say, what are the needs of the prisoners as a whole? And then we can't meet all the needs, we do the priority. And I think trauma is a high priority. I think RJ is effective and has a high impact. But again, I go back to this insularity. The prison service does what the prison service always does, because it always does it. And if it hasn't invented it, it's reluctant to do anything else. So I go back yet again to culture.
Great. Before I thank our speakers, let me just say 2 things. I mean, one is, these events don't just happen. They happen because of the immense work that Joan Concannon, who's the director of the festival, and her team do, Sarah and Naomi and others who are in contact with me for months and who run everything, and it is just, they do a tremendous job, and I would just like to thank them. Second group I'd like to thank before I thank our speakers is you. The festival works best because we get great audiences who ask really good questions that are meaningful, that are authentic, that go to the heart of problems. So thank you very, very much. And please, that's not just to flatter you, to ask you to come back at 2 o'clock, because at 2 o'clock we will be looking at policing, and then at 4 o'clock we'll be looking at punishment. I've got the team produces for me a sort of handout for things to do, and there's a little paragraph here about saying thanks, and I'm not going to read it because I don't need to, because that was just a fantastic session. I can feel it in the room. Thank you ever so much, all 4 of you. It was just tremendous. Thank you.